there was a bang, and we all said, what was that? Was that a shot?
John Kennedy's been shot.
The announcement came on the radio that the president, in fact, had died.
Chet Huntley from NBC News broke in.
President Kennedy was assassinated today in a burst of gunfire in downtown Dallas.
Suddenly he was gone.
And of course everybody said, well, it can't be true, it can't be true. I mean, this can't be true.
You just don't believe something like that's happening in America.
I feared for the future of the nation.
And I cried and cried and cried.
Shock, dismay, anger, sorrow.
And seeing everybody just with that look of panic and being upset, and it was everywhere.
The life of the nation changed in a cataclysmic way.
JFK, the day that changed America. From historic Faneuil Hall in Boston, here is Chris Matthews.
Good evening. Boston is where you'll find John F. Kennedy's electoral roots. It was from here the young veteran was elected to the Congress in the years just after World War II. It was here that he won his seat in the U.S. Senate. When Kennedy bid for the nation's highest office, it was here in Boston, right here in Faneuil Hall, that JFK made his final campaign appearance on Election Eve, 1960. Kennedy won that election, of course, one of the closest ever. But his presidency also turned out to be among the shortest. After barely 1,000 days in office, John F. Kennedy was assassinated. It was in Dallas, Texas, on November 22nd, 1963. It was a day that changed America. Over the next hour, we'll hear from an extraordinary cross-section of Americans, remembering that day and the days that followed, the sense of shock, of stark, violent loss. No one who lived through it will ever forget. John F. Kennedy brought possibility to the White House in the early 60s, youthful energy and idealism mixed with the tough-minded pragmatism of a political pro. He made mistakes, but learned from them. And by late 1963, he was confident, popular, eager for a second term. The trip to Texas that November was a preview of the '64 campaign. Wife Jacqueline, who had recently lost a new baby, was at his side. Leaving Washington that morning, John F. Kennedy seemed on the top of the world, at the top of his game.
Here is the news. Here's a report from San Antonio from NBC News' Robert McNeil from WOAI TV.
For a trip the White House again calls non-political, the president arrived with a very political-looking escort of 17 Democratic congressmen and Mrs. Kennedy. Kennedy went to several cities in Texas to try, looking towards the election in 1964, to try and calm the splits among Texas Democrats who were torn apart.
White Southerners did not like Kennedy's basic principles, his call to end racial discrimination. The hate mail poured into the White House. A good many people who hated him already hated him because he was a Catholic. But Kennedy wasn't deterred by hate mail or by criticism.
And it was Mrs. Kennedy who was featured at the arrival, turning on the smile that hasn't been used in domestic politicking since the campaign in 1960.
Oh, she was thrilled to be going because she was going to help Jack. It was, quote, help Jack, unquote.
Kennedy was different. He was younger. He had a lot of pizzazz. The nation became enamored with this young, attractive, able, articulate President of the United States.
Tomorrow, the president visits Dallas, where police are taking special precautions in case of unfriendly demonstrations. Kennedy had been warned that it could be dangerous to go to Dallas because there were right-wing opponents there.
Just the day or so before the visit is where a few things came out, like a brochure that was handed out that President Kennedy was wanted for treason.
We would be foolish, I think, not to anticipate some trouble. I don't anticipate any violence.
It could not have been a more joyous, enthusiastic crowd. And that was all remarkable, given all the apprehension about how Dallas would receive him.
I was 6 cars back in the motorcade in Dallas. We came around under the underpass and on to Dealey Plaza and past an undistinguished building, which I later learned was the Texas School Book Depository.
The car turned off of Houston onto Elm Street and started approaching us, and I guess when it was probably 50 to 100 feet from us, we heard two noises that were fairly close together that sounded like firecrackers to me.
And there was a bang, and we all said, what was that? Was that a shot? Was that a backfire? Was it a fireworks? And there was that kind of exchange, and then there was a bang, bang, like that, close together. I said, those are shots.
When it got directly in front of us is when the third shot hit him in the head, and he fell over into Mrs. Kennedy's lap.
And I could remember her hollering, oh my God, no, they've shot Jack. And that's when I turned to Gail and I said, that's it, hit the ground.
It was impossible to tell at once where Kennedy was hit, but bullet wounds in Governor Conley's chest were plainly visible.
I was 23 years old. I was working in a newsroom in Omaha, Nebraska. The newsroom was abandoned. I was the only one on shift. I had gotten to work that morning at about 5, and I had just finished the noon news. And the bells began to ring on the AP and the UPI ticker. I wandered over to see what was going on and stared in disbelief.
I was in the CBS newsroom. I called Frank Stanton, who was the president of CBS, and the secretary said, Mr. Hewitt, he can't be disturbed. He's in a meeting. He'll call you back. I said, disturb him. She said, what do you mean? I said, the president of the United States has been shot. She said, oh my God, wait.
In those days, in the Midwest at least, the network was dark. There was no network, and it was local programming, and we had a kind of woman show that talked about gardening. I ran downstairs at KMTV in Omaha and began to read a bulletin on the air, and you know, everyone was discombobulated and disoriented.
The air was filled with the screams of women and children, a sort of very feminine wailing filled the air, and everybody lay down on the sidewalks, on the grass, on the edge of the parkway.
Like a million people screaming shrilly, a most amazing sound of high soprano wails.
The car in front of us went from 8 miles an hour to 80 miles an hour, and I knew something was wrong.
I asked Chief Curry to call Parkland Hospital, emergency, you know, through his police network, and tell them that we were on our way and to be ready for us and so forth.
Policeman stopped me, asked me who I was, and I was just telling him when a little black boy came up and said to us, Mister, I seen a man with a gun right up in the window there. And then a woman, very distracted woman, came up and said, he wasn't hurt, was he? And I said, I don't know. And the policeman said he was hurt bad. He took me over to his motorcycle, and the radio was saying severe head wounds, Parkland Hospital.
It was such a sudden impact that it had. I can recall I hit the ground with my fist a couple of times like that, and I said, some son of a bitch has shot the president.
I was in Washington. I was in my White House car coming back from a luncheon meeting and received word to get back to the White House immediately, and I returned and heard that terrible news.
That was the first time I remember sort of going out in the streets and seeing everybody just with that look of panic and being upset, and it was everywhere.
Associated Press journalist read the bulletin on the wire and brought it into my office, and I was infuriated and said, Rocky, if this is somebody's idea of a joke, it's sick. And his eyes welled up with tears. And he said, John, I wish it were.
I was a sophomore in high school, and our teacher was called out of the room. And when he came back in, he just looked stricken. And he said, I remember this, they've shot the president. You couldn't even believe it. I mean, it seemed so unimaginable in America, at least the kind of safe, secure America I'd grown up in.
I was glued to the television because I just didn't think it was true. I thought there has to be a mistake. And if he was shot, he's going to be all right.
Our headmaster took the microphone to tell us that our hero, President Kennedy, had been shot. And there was a shock that went through all of us because he was our hero. He was us, Irish, Catholic, from Boston.
I heard it on my car radio that President Kennedy had been shot. And it was so sad. It was unbelievable. I cried like so many hundreds, thousands, and millions of Americans.
The nuns immediately got the entire school up out of their desks and over to the church to pray for the president.
Learning that the president was critically wounded, stunned Chicagoans turned to their churches, leaving their offices in the Loop, their homes and businesses in the suburbs.
My family were really not religious people, and I remember being drawn to the temple and people drawn to their houses of worship just to go there and get some sense of comfort.
I was in Holy Cross College. The professor came in and said that the president's been shot. And he didn't have many details, and everybody just sort of was shocked. He said he may be dying, we don't know.
I was in Studio 8H, where Saturday Night Live comes from. I was looking at renderings for a set of a new game show that I was doing there, producing there, and someone came in and said, "John Kennedy's been shot." And all of us became motionless. I remember it vividly. And we just quietly put down and said, "That ends the day," and we left and went to the news floor of NBC because we knew everybody in there if we could pick up something. And as we walked, people were coming down, all the news people crying, tears running down their face.
Secret Service man came up to me when I identified myself, and he told me the president had been shot, Governor Connolly had been shot, and they were at Parkland Hospital. So we raced over there in a deputy sheriff's car, and when I got there, I went in the basement where dozens of people were gathered, grieving, somber. Hysteria was traveling around that room like an epidemic.
They have sent out from Parkland Hospital a call for top surgical specialists in Dallas, and also a call for a Roman Catholic priest. But again, the best information we have now is that the president is still alive.
So we got off the elevator and went around the corner out into the main part of the emergency room, and I saw immediately there was a huge crowd there, very uncharacteristically. And then the crowd parted as I got about halfway down toward trauma room 1, and I saw Mrs. Kennedy sitting there on the chair with her blood-stained clothing on, and I thought, oh my.
Frank, to interrupt for a moment, there is this from Dallas. President Kennedy has been given blood transfusions at Parkland Hospital in an effort to save his life.
JFK, the day that changed America.
A flash from Dallas. 2 priests who were with President Kennedy say he is dead of bullet wounds.
The black, ugly words are in print. President shot dead, president dead.
We got into a police car, went out to Air Force One. I didn't know why. It had been removed to a remote corner of Love Field and guarded now by a cordon of heavily armed, very menacing-looking men. I got on the airplane, and then suddenly from the rear of the plane came this 6'4" figure of Lyndon Johnson.
And Judge Hughes was about to administer the oath when Johnson asked one of the staffers to see whether Mrs. Kennedy wanted to participate. And so we waited a few minutes, and then she arrived into the room. And of course, the room fell silent at this point. Johnson walked over to her, took her by the hand, and placed her to his left. Mrs. Johnson was on his right. And then he nodded, and she proceeded with the oath. Immediately after the oath, he kissed Mrs. Johnson. He went over and kissed Mrs. Kennedy.
This afternoon, wherever you were and whatever you might have been doing when you received the word of the death of President Kennedy, that is a moment that will be emblazoned in your memory, and you will never forget it as long as you live.
This was my closest friend, my leader, my guide, my hero, my role model, my champion. He was the center of my life and my attention, and suddenly he was gone.
I was stunned. I thought, this doesn't happen. You know, I'd grown up in the heartland in small-town America, kind of the innocence of that time. Even though the specter of the Cold War was hanging over us, we didn't shoot our presidents, and not this president.
My first reaction, since after all I'd known him a long time, was it's not possible. Jack does not get shot. President McKinley gets shot. Abraham Lincoln gets shot. Jack Kennedy does not get shot.
It was a terrible time because you didn't know what happened. Were we being attacked? Was this the Russians? Was it the Cubans? Was it the Mafia? Nobody knew.
Shock, dismay, anger, sorrow, a mixture. And immediately I thought about what happens to the armed services, the armed forces, because the commander-in-chief has just been killed.
We were in the second day of rehearsal of the Van Dyke show, and all of a sudden somebody says, come into the prop room, which is where the television was, and there was the news, Cronkite, telling us that we lost our president. And we just sat there. We looked at each other. Should we go home? Should we do what? And we decided that we're going to do the show 3 days hence. But I said, we can't ask people to laugh at it. Nobody's going to laugh. And we decided, the only show out of 158 shows we did without a studio audience.
My mother came to pick me up at school, and she seemed strange, and she seemed sad, and you know, she took me home and said, you know, the president's been killed, a great man's been killed. And so, you know, and it was weird because I thought about it a lot on September 11th, because I went to pick my daughter up.
Life in a good part of the United States, and indeed a good part of the world, remains at a virtual standstill, stunned into immobility by the assassination of President Kennedy.
My father went out because there were some men from the city who were working with the flooding on the street outside. My father was out there, and they must have had their radio on. And I remember just watching it, like through the window, like a scene in a movie. I could see that in the rain, my father had started to cry and was listening to something, and he came running in the house and with the rain pouring, and I could see he was crying, and he ran to the phone to call my mother at work to tell her. And that's when he told me.
I feared for the future of the nation and the future of the civil rights movement, because we saw the Kennedy administration as a sympathetic referee in the struggle for civil rights.
The face and voice of a young girl summed it up.
What's your feeling right now?
I really couldn't say. Really, right now I just don't know what to do. I don't even know where to go, what to say. There's nothing for me to say.
All of a sudden the world became a nasty place, because you'd say, how could this happen? Our president, so attractive, the family, the whole thing. I mean, how could this happen? So it was, in a sense, maybe for me, the first time of the loss of an age of innocence.
Here you were watching this guy, Lee Harvey Oswald, being taken from the, the jail in Dallas, and you actually saw him get shot.
He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's the man with a gun. It's absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters.
JFK, the day that changed America.
Good evening. The essential facts are these. President Kennedy was murdered in Dallas, Texas. He was shot by a sniper hiding in a building near his parade route. He was dead within an hour. Lyndon Johnson is President of the United States.
The other images that stand out in my mind of that weekend are Jackie standing below the airplane at Andrews Air Force Base waiting for the coffin to be lowered, and seeing what appeared to be blood on the clothing of the president's wife.
I remember thinking at the time that he can't possibly have been killed. You know, it was incomprehensible to me that the president would be killed.
The whole White House staff couldn't believe what had happened. They walked around on tiptoe, no noise in the hall. Halls were always noisy and full of laughter and people teasing each other, greeting each other, not a sound.
And when I got to Washington at the airport, I was told that Caroline and John had been taken from the White House to our house in Georgetown, and that they had not been told of their father's assassination, all of the radios and televisions had been, of course, unplugged, so they wouldn't try to turn it on and watch a cartoon and discover the news that way.
I felt that I had not only lost my president, but I lost a friend. I was like in slow motion that whole time. I mean, it was to try to sleep and eat, but you were glued to the television because I wanted to know everything that was going on.
The sniper's nest has been found, and police have recovered a British .303 rifle with a telescopic sight. Also, police searching that area found 3 empty .303 cartridge cases.
One man has been taken into custody. He was taken into custody in the Texas Theater in Dallas.
The Dallas Police Chief, Jesse Curry, announced just a few moments ago that charges of murdering President Kennedy have been filed against Lee Harvey Oswald.
I don't know what this is all about.
You killed the president?
No, sir, I didn't. People keep asking me that. Sir?
You shoot the president?
I work in that building.
Were you in the building at the time?
Naturally, if I work in that building, yes, sir.
Back up, man. Did you shoot the president?
No, they're taking me in because of the fact that I lived in the Soviet Union. I'm just a patsy.
And looking at the chief of police in that crowded, hot-looking corridor in Dallas a while ago, seemed to me to be that all this sadness and horror was caused by a punk with a mail-order rifle.
We have suffered a loss that cannot be weighed. I ask for your help and God's.
There was a solemn procession in Washington early this morning as the body of President Kennedy was taken to the White House from the Bethesda Naval Hospital. The chief executive returned for the last time to the house from which he had governed the nation.
And I sat on this little couch for days and days and days, and I didn't eat, I didn't talk. I was sort of lost inside myself, and I cried and cried and cried.
President Kennedy gave us all hope. I mean, he was young, he was vibrant, and we all had a sense of purpose. To see him go like that, it was devastating.
For some reason, I walked in the East Room first, and there in the middle of the room was a stand with the president's casket on it. It's just impossible to realize or believe that all that life and vigor and grace and joy was gone.
It is quiet at the White House. It's a dull, gray day. It's raining here. Within the confines of that great White House, a lonely little boy who observes his 3rd birthday Monday wandered through a big Washington house today complaining, "I don't have anyone to play with."
All of America was in shock that weekend. No one more than Jacqueline Kennedy, suddenly a widow at age 34. Yet she took charge of planning a funeral worthy of a Lincoln, a Roosevelt, a John F. Kennedy. Over the next 2 days, there would be a solemn procession to the Capitol where the body would lie in state, a funeral service attended by dignitaries from around the world, and finally the burial at Arlington National Cemetery. All of it watched on television by an audience of millions. I'll be back with that part of the story in a moment.
JFK, the day that changed America. From historic Faneuil Hall in Boston, here again is Chris Matthews.
Welcome back. The assassination of John F. Kennedy was a horrific crime and a national trauma. It was also one of the biggest news stories ever. Here's the New York Times from the morning after. Kennedy is killed by sniper as he rides in car in Dallas. Johnson sworn in on plane. But for millions of Americans, it all unfolded on television, which stayed with the story nonstop. It was unprecedented. And that common experience over those 4 days bonded the country in mourning and even now in memory. On Sunday, November 24th, Kennedy's body was to be moved from the White House to the Capitol Rotunda, where it would lie in state. Lee Harvey Oswald, the accused killer, was to be transferred to county jail. For a grieving nation, it was the 2nd day of gunfire.
This is Charles Murphy in the Dallas County Jail in Dallas, Texas, where we, along with about 40 reporters and photographers, are awaiting the arrival, a transfer of Lee Oswald, expected
within the next few minutes.
We're told there's a crowd of about 2,500 people around the county jail area.
We were going out for Sunday dinner. And so I thought I would just turn the TV on and see what was going on. And so I leaned over and turned the television on, and just as the picture was forming, I could hear them saying, "He's been shot, he's been shot."
He's been shot. He's been shot. Lee Oswald has been shot. There's the man with a gun. It's absolute panic here in the basement of Dallas Police Headquarters.
It was astounding. I mean, here you were watching this guy, Lee Harvey Oswald, being taken from the, in the jail in Dallas, and you actually saw him get shot.
And I just couldn't believe that it would happen. A man accused of assassinating the President of the United States. Well, how can these things happen? What's going on,
Now, lying very pale on the stretcher, he's being put into the ambulance, head first.
It was about 17 minutes past 12 Eastern Standard Time when it happened, roughly 45 minutes before President Kennedy's body was to be moved from the White House and carried to the Capitol Rotunda.
I remember watching it on TV and seeing my mother hysterical crying. And when you're a kid, you want to do something and you can't do anything. And my mother was very upset when they showed John Jr. And, oh, that little boy, and what's going to happen to him?
The crowd is very silent, lying very deeply on both sides of the avenue.
I'll never forget the drum beat of the cadence when they took him down the streets in Washington, D.C. Dut, 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 dut.
But the part that really stunned me and brought me quickly to the reality that it's true, he's gone, was when, in the military tradition, the horse in which a president might ride came with the saddle empty and the boots and the stirrups turned backwards. It meant he is no more, that the president is dead.
Well, Mrs. Kennedy showed such dignity and composure and kindness to everybody else that she was absolutely, she riveted everybody. She calmed them down, she comforted them by the way she held herself up.
I think everybody just looked at her and said, well, God, she's the man's wife. If she can hold it together, then we have to.
I never could understand how someone could be that strong. I mean, we were all crying, and she was strong for the nation.
If anyone ever epitomized the expression grace under pressure, it is Jacqueline Kennedy. Within the space of less than 4 months, she has lost a child and her husband. The beauty of character she displayed is something we might all wish to emulate when we are called upon to face tragedy in our own lives.
After the ceremony is concluded, the people will file past the body of their late president. There's now a line 4 blocks long, 4 abreast, people waiting to file through.
These people coming through now have been waiting for at least 10 or 12 hours, waiting very quietly. Good order.
I actually went down to D.C. I grew up in New Jersey. My mom and dad, who were huge Kennedy fans, we drove down to D.C. To view the body, you know. I remember we drove down at night. We got in line. We were all there all night. It was really cold.
I was there, and just standing in line, and just people, black, white, short, tall, rich, poor, just in line crying.
Oh, I was devastated. I spent a
lost weekend, literally, at Yale, glued to this little black and white television set, watching every instant of what was happening, and just despondent.
Silently they walked, faces that seemed to mirror disbelief.
This is when television came alive, because before that, television had covered, really, it was more political, and all of a sudden you had a television in your home watching these things unfold.
The continuing grief is evident across the United States. Amusement places have shut down. Many sporting events scheduled for the day and for this weekend have been postponed or canceled.
I was supposed to do a stand-up with Dinah Shore in California, but on the news of the president being assassinated, they went dark, and then they went dark for about 2 days. I went out and learned a lot about comedy that night, because it was one of the best audiences I ever played to, because they had to get away from, they just had to get away from the news. They had to deny it for a couple hours and then go back and face it again.
Monday, November 25th, 1963. And we're originating our program in Washington, where funeral and burial services for John Fitzgerald Kennedy take place today.
We finally got to within, you know, maybe 10 feet of getting in there, and they closed it because they had to get ready for the procession. So we lined up, we stood on Pennsylvania Avenue and watched the dignitaries go by in the caisson roll by with the casket and the flag and everything.
The image of the family, the grieving family, and maybe the long, cold walk was the image that I would most remember. That really was, it was a tragic remembrance, both beautiful and horrible at the same time.
It was just momentous. It was as though the world had shifted and turned upside down. But she carried herself with such dignity.
Jacqueline Kennedy in mourning, Bobby and Teddy flanking her, still touch me when I see it. And of course those pictures of John and Caroline touch everyone.
That little boy saluting will forever be indelibly inscribed, I think, in you. I think it was a moment when there wasn't a dry eye in America.
I think he personified what America was feeling, because we were all children in a very strange time. We all became very vulnerable.
And when I heard the sound of the bagpipes, I just dissolved. I just broke down and started sobbing.
I felt like crying. And I think that was not a personal emotion. I think that was almost a universal emotion. His loss was felt so much throughout the world. One couldn't help but feel sorrow, not just for the loss of the president, and for his death.
The eternal flame she'd seen in France and other places, other countries have it. But she spoke to them about it, and they said, yes, we'll do it. And they did it especially for the president.
And so, on this crisp but sunny November afternoon, John F. Kennedy, the 35th President of the United States, is laid to rest on a gentle slope overlooking the city of Washington.
Americans have been trying to come to terms with John F. Kennedy's death for 40 years. Not just his death, but the meaning of his life and his presidency. What was he able to accomplish in his 1,000 days? What more might he have done if he had lived? The questions won't go away.
Let the word go forth from this time and place to friend and foe alike that the torch has been passed to a new generation of Americans.
He certainly was, for my generation and succeeding generations, the most eloquent president that we've had. For people who are more conservative. I think that Ronald Reagan fills that role for them, but even the Reagan people will be the first to say that no one quite matched the eloquence of John Kennedy, and he changed the presidency in that regard.
The main thing that was apparent about Kennedy is that he made Americans feel very good about themselves and feel hopeful.
He was a highly intelligent individual and such a wonderful speaker. And he's married to Jackie and had these beautiful children. I mean, it was a Camelot, idyllic kind of time.
It wasn't Camelot. It was Boston. It was Washington. It was the sign of Irish immigrants to this country. And television had come along and enhanced the glamour of it. But the Kennedy administration, I assure you, was not Camelot. It was politics.
We were more accepting of the Camelot because of the tragedy. I think if you tried to pull that off now with a new generation that wasn't there, I don't think it would work.
What should be remembered is that the glamorous image could be used to rouse people's interest in politics. Some of it was directed toward tapping into people's idealism.
I think that the Peace Corps was one of the most effective things for our foreign policy that's ever been conceived of. Those initial Peace Corps volunteers did more for the good of America worldwide than anything we can conceive of.
To those people in the huts and villages of half the globe struggling to break the bonds of mass misery, we pledge our best efforts to help them help themselves.
The legacy that President Kennedy left that enabled President Johnson to go forward on civil rights and the war on poverty, I think the 60s did a lot of good for the country, and it wouldn't have happened without President Kennedy's life, or even maybe without his sacrifice for service.
The 60s really started then. The early 60s were the 50s. I mean, there was nothing radical very much going on. And after he got shot, everything changed.
He had begun the process of knitting us together as one people, regardless of race, regardless of religion. And that means that in many families, still to this day, he is the political hero.
You hear young people saying today, I got involved. I decided to get involved in the civil rights movement, to run for office because I was inspired by the life of John F. Kennedy.
I think everybody wants to be like Jack Kennedy because the inspiration that he provided to so many Americans, and his martyrdom, let's be frank, obviously covered up some failings that he may have had, as every president has had.
He has been given the kind of reverence which he didn't earn when he was alive, and probably would not have exercised if he had survived Dallas.
Nonetheless, I think that you could have to say that it's a legacy that that most politicians would do well to aspire to give the country a sense of mission and of hope and direction.
Let every nation know, whether it wishes us well or ill, that we shall pay any price, bear any burden, meet any hardship, support any friend, oppose any foe, to assure the survival and the success of liberty.
He was the first telegenic president. I think he mesmerized people by the way he looked, the way he spoke, the way he acted, the way he carried himself. He certainly was charismatic.
One of the biggest things that he did is he just, I think, inspired a generation, felt like him. We don't really have that with our leaders, I think, today.
I think it was probably the last time that the country could ever really trust who sat in the Oval Office.
I think much of it was a promise unmet. And yet, in some ways, I think the sense of romanticism about admiring a president and everything he stood for and confidence in government, that sort of died with JFK.
The world changed after JFK's death. The country changed. We plunged a few months later deep into the war in Vietnam that Kennedy had specifically taken steps not to do, I think he would have found a way to negotiate, just as he had ended the Berlin crisis, just as he had ended the Cuban Missile Crisis.
In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it.
He really faced down the Russians at a time when it wasn't so easy to face down the Russians, and it was a very, very dangerous point. Thus far, probably the most dangerous point in our history.
The legacy in the space program, I really love the idea, not just for what it means to go there, but what it means to our dreams.
Together, let us explore the stars, conquer the deserts, eradicate disease, tap the ocean depths, and encourage the arts and commerce.
So much of what he stood for was right and is just and noble, and he believed that everybody in this country should have an opportunity at a great life. And those are good messages, and that's why they live.
And even in hindsight, now looking back, and all the little peccadillos and all the little flaws that we have been revealed, and so, still does not take away from that potential that we all saw.
You read what Kennedy had to say, and it's still fresh air.
All this will not be finished in the first 100 days, nor will it be finished in the first 1,000 days, nor in the life of this administration, nor even perhaps in our lifetime on this planet. But let us begin.
He made us believe that the country was something extraordinary.
Presidents are often less about what they really do than how they're perceived and how they use the pulpit. And in his case, he used it to dream great things and ask the American people to do the same.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
I'll return in a moment with my own memories of John F. Kennedy's life and death. Where was I when I heard the news? Not very far from here. I'll take you back for a visit.
Once again, Chris Matthews.
This is the campus of Holy Cross, not far from Boston. I was a freshman here in 1963 when I heard the news about John F. Kennedy. It was just after lunch, and I was down in the basement of Kimball Hall checking my mailbox. And a classmate came up and said, "Somebody's just shot Kennedy." I had a world history class that afternoon, and by the time I got there, everyone was talking and wondering what had happened. All we knew is that someone had taken a shot at the president, nothing else. The history professor, James Powers, announced that he would hold the lecture, but we didn't have to stay.
From Dallas, Texas.
When I got to a TV, I turned it on and sat there amazed as Walter Cronkite told what had happened. And then, taking off his reading glasses, said that the president was dead.
Eastern Standard Time.
I remember going through a terminal in New York a few days later and an older woman asking me where I went to school. When I told her Holy Cross, I remember her saying how people must be so sad up there in Kennedy's home state. It was a lot bigger than that. I think something changed in this country that day. We went from the early 60s of short haircuts and thin ties and the new frontier to the 60s of the Beatles, drugs, and protest. It took 4 years until the Gene McCarthy-Bob Kennedy race of 1968 to bring back the hopes that had died that early Friday afternoon of November 22nd. Myself, I was lucky to spend the last years of the 60s in the Peace Corps in Africa. It was a life-changing experience, and I have Jack Kennedy to thank for it. I will never forget listening on the shortwave radio as Americans stepped on the moon, that other JFK program that changed everything. Senator Pat Mourning of New York, who worked for President Kennedy and loved him, once said to me, "The country's never gotten over Kennedy's death. You, Chris, haven't gotten over it." I will always take that as the deepest, warmest compliment. It was as if the old new frontiersman was welcoming me into a compact of those who would know and live the loss. I'm Chris Matthews. Thank you for joining us.
The energy, the faith, the devotion which we bring to this endeavor will light our country and all who serve it. And the glow from that fire can truly light the world.